Good evening, and welcome to the 2022 Puget Sound Book Artists panel discussion. This year, 53 artists submitted 60 books for display in the Collins Memorial Library on the campus of the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. We want to take a moment to thank Jane Carlin, Library Director, and Jamie Spain, her right-hand woman, for their invaluable help and assistance. My name is Peter Newland. I'm a member of this year's curatorial team, which was headed by Tracy Timmons and includes Mark Hopman and Rachel Watson. It's my pleasure to moderate the 2022 discussion between and with 4 artists who are in the show. Before I introduce them and we begin an inquiry into the particular interpretation of this year's exhibit's theme, Peaks and Valleys, let's take a moment to review PSBA's mission and purpose. The organization was founded in 2010 as a forum for the exchange of ideas, as an opportunity for collaborative projects, and for enhancing our individual skill and knowledge in the book arts. Over the past decade, the organization has grown tenfold. Its influence stretches far beyond Washington's South Sound and now includes members from Tacoma to Texas and all points in between. The group promotes learning and the book arts through exhibition, workshops, lectures, publications, and discussions like the one you are about to experience. Joining us this evening are 4 accomplished book artists discussing their entries addressing the exhibit theme, Peaks and Valleys. They are from Tacoma, Nancy Brones. The name of her book, Mappa Musica, A Musical Journey from There to Here. And from University Place, Kim Izenman. Her book is entitled Grief. And from LaConner, Washington, Lynn Skordal, The Age of Reason. And from Olympia, Ray Zill, Peaks and Valleys. We'll begin with some general questions that each panelist will answer, and then we'll come to some specific questions about their own book. So let's start this way. Question 1, and we'll go in this direction for the panel. Finding something to say and the right way to say it is the initial work of the book artist. Concept is foremost in the book art field. The idea leads. Please take a few minutes to tell our viewers how you got your idea for your book. Nancy, we'll begin with you.
Generally, I don't have the idea for the book right at the beginning. I usually have several different ideas, and I'm a person who enjoys research. So I generally start with libraries and starting to research a particular topic, and generally that leads me in some direction. It is never a straight line. It's always kind of out of the blue. It can be a word, it can be a mention of another book. In this particular case, I started with the idea of a topographical map, and I didn't end up there. So it basically travels through my brain, and it has to germinate.
Thank you. Kim?
This particular book wasn't going to be a book at all. I had decided that I wasn't going to have an entry this year because of things that were happening in my personal life. And But at the same time, I was really disappointed in myself for not having something and not having an idea. I have to say that I woke up one morning, obviously I had been working on this subconsciously, because I woke up one morning and knew exactly what this was going to be. But I had been gathering material for it, not knowing that it was going to be a book. I had started, I was dealing with spending days during COVID with my mother in hospice, and coming home and doing little tiny embroideries just to, as a friend put it, try to stitch my life back together again after having a day-long chaos. And woke up one morning and knew that these little pieces were going to go into a book, and I knew the form it was going to take. I would say that that's probably the way most of my books happen, is something subconsciously, I'm working something subconsciously, and then I just suddenly have a picture of what it's, not what it's going to look like, but what it's going to be, I guess. So that's how it started this time, anyway.
Thank you. Lynn?
I often work the same as Kim and Nancy, maybe discovering what the book is going to be as I work on it. But this book was different. This was one of a series, not a real series, but a group of books that I was doing during quarantine and reacting directly to the pandemic. The pandemic was bad enough in the death toll it took, and I did books about that, but it just, to me, it was appalling to see the death of things that we had all taken for granted in civilization. And the pandemic revealed fractures in our communities and fractures in our public life, and things that we had all taken for granted were disappearing or going by the wayside. So very specifically, I set out to do a little bit of a memorial to things that we were losing in the pandemic. And it's called The Age of Reason, but it's really about the disappearance or the death of the Age of Reason and other things that we took for granted. So it's a memorial. It started out that way, and it came together very quickly.
Thank you. And Ray, how about your book?
Yeah, I typically write the poetry first and then build the structure around it, but this book was different. It was opposite. I wanted to do something different, and so I was inspired by two different flag books that I seen. One from Laura Russell that was on display at my library, and it used Polaroid photos as the flags, and so I knew I wanted to incorporate instant film. And then I saw another flag book by Marjorie Hellman, I believe, Wave Words, where she cuts the flags into shapes that look like ocean waves. And so I was inspired by the structure first and wanting to do something different, wanting to do a flag book. And then the poem came second. When I heard the prospectus for this exhibit, I decided to write a poem called Peaks and Valleys, and so that's where the title came from.
Thank you. And we'll go in reverse order with our second question. So Ray, you'll get to start. And the question is this: the meaning of every book is influenced by its physical form. When there is an engaging synthesis between the story and the page, the reader's experience is enhanced. Each of you chose a different structure to tell your version of Peaks and Valleys. Can you talk a bit about why you chose the structure and materials you did, and also if there were structures or materials that you considered but rejected, and why?
Yeah, I usually do accordion books, so I thought this was familiar enough to me, but I wanted to do something different, so the flag book presented itself. And the theme Peaks and Valleys, when I thought about it, I thought about ups and downs, ebbs and flows, like we've all been feeling throughout the past few years of pandemic life. And I felt that it kind of reminiscent of other struggles I felt throughout my life: grief, loss, divorce. And I began to see peaks and valleys kind of intersect, overlap. sometimes an up and a down happens at the same time. And so that's kind of what inspired what my book looks like. There's a lot of peaks and valleys intersecting, overlapping, and kind of existing together, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
For this book, the peaks and valleys is kind of obvious. We are supposed to be the shining city on the hill, which would be the peak of our existence here in this country. And now during the pandemic, we're revealing some valleys, some low points. And with the idea of doing a memorial for those things, it was obvious to me that I wanted to use a Victorian photo album to do it. And to the inside, I used cabinet cards, which I've got a lot, and then another version of the cabinet card, these death announcements, which were handed out at funerals in Victorian times. So what I ended up doing was taking apart two albums I already had and putting them together to get the effect I wanted. The guts of one that I had to repair, and then I kind of grafted that all into this white album. And then I altered the cabinet cards, and on the death cards I did text by just putting simple white lines on a black background and then gluing it on so that it appeared that the text was then part of it. So the structure was kind of obvious but effective, and came together pretty nicely.
Thank you. Kim?
I often use maze fold structure for my books because I almost always incorporate stitching or some kind of sewing, surface adornment sewing in my books, and I just like the way that the sewing can flow in a maze fold book. I also like maze fold books because I start out, as I did with this one, with a flat piece of paper, and I paint an abstract painting on that paper, and then I fold and cut to make the pages. So it kind of helps. It just helps the flow of the book when I have a large piece that is then fragmented. In this particular one, in the sewing, I also used fragmented pieces of silk that had shattered off of a crazy quilt that my grandmother had given me long ago, and the silk is really old and shattering, and I keep all these little microscopic pieces in a little dish, and I incorporated those into it. But that just all sort of, when you fold the book out, you can fold it out to its original large painting if you wanted to, and that's just, I just like maze fold books because of that. You know, that's just the way I work, I guess.
Thank you.
When I heard the term peaks and valleys, my first reaction was, I think like everybody else, was the ups and downs of the pandemic. But for me, I hadn't journaled and I hadn't done anything during the pandemic because I was dealing, like Kim, with some personal issues that just took my time. But when peaks and valleys hit me, I realized that I had made a book and learned a structure in 1990. At the time, it didn't have a name. It was just called a folded book. And it's folded and glued in such a way that it opens out into essentially peaks and valleys. So my first idea was to incorporate that into the topographical maps that I mentioned, because the topographical maps, of course, are flat, but they reference differences in elevation. And that didn't work. I didn't like it, and it wasn't working. I actually had then the idea to address my own personal musical journey of starting music lessons when I was about 7 years old. And I realized that in looking at that, because my piano teacher and I had discussed fugues, And a fugue is a layering of intertwining themes. And that seemed to come through because, as I looked at it, there were a lot of peaks and valleys. So then I had another book structure that I thought was going to work, and I didn't like it. So I came back to my original peaks and valleys, and because I normally work in watercolor, I had to adjust the paper because watercolor paper would not have worked very well for the format because it requires folding down, opening, because the pages themselves are 9 by 9, but it folds down to about 4 by 5. So it was the kind of thing where I had to think about in the structure what materials I was going to use to make sure that I could get the message across. So I chose a paper that would fold easily, but would still, when it was opened out, it wouldn't fall flat, so that it had some body, so that you could actually visually see the peaks and the valleys.
Very good, thank you. So moving to some individual questions, let's start with you, Nancy, since you're already warmed up. And just to tell you that everything I know about Beethoven and the piano, I learned from Charles Schultz and the Peanuts cartoon with Schroeder. And I would likely choose Ray Charles before Beethoven, or Mozart for that matter. But I do remember growing up every Sunday, the family watching Liberace. So I've concluded from that the piano is foundational in making all kinds of music,
Yes.
even in this digital age. And so I think everybody'd be interested to know if you tell us a bit about how you got started playing the piano and how that overlaps with your book art work.
I was probably 6 or 7, and I wanted a piano. And I can't tell you exactly why. I think I was enchanted by the sound of the piano. But we lived in a very tiny, we're talking about a very, very tiny house. And my parents said, there's no room in this house for a piano. So I started, those of you who remember Lawrence Welk's show, I was given an accordion. It wasn't my idea of a piano, but the keyboard is just like a piano keyboard, and you learn to read music, and you understand a bit of the structure. So I then did that until my parents moved into a larger house, and I looked in the classified ads and found a very old upright piano at the right price. I do not remember my father picking it up or actually how it appeared at the house, but it did. And it was in working order. And probably, Peter, like you, I was a nerdy kid, and so I liked Beethoven even when I was quite small. But my parents liked church music and hymns, and my father liked polkas. So I was kind of the odd man out in the family. So one of my early teachers, my very first teacher, of course, was the choir director at church. And I had to learn what she wanted me to study. But as I progressed, I knew that wasn't really what I wanted to do. And so I then was taking lessons, and I took lessons all the way through school and all the way through high school. And then I went to college, and then I took only a semester in college because I couldn't fit it in with everything else. And that's really been the trajectory of the ups and downs, because I have lived in several different places, and sometimes I had a piano and sometimes I didn't. And the thing for me about the piano is that it is, first of all, an intellectual exercise. It is a musical and kind of sensory exercise. And I actually find that it's very creative I find a lot of relationship between music and and actually the book arts, because both of them challenge you in such a way that you're really reaching into your creative sense to pull a feeling out of the music, whether it's Ray Charles or whether it is Bach. So the overlap for me is that both of the activities are very creative in different kinds of ways, but I find that when I get too wrapped up, both drawing and painting and the music is actually a wonderful creative outlet to reduce the stress. So for me, the music has been a real critical part of my life. And actually what precipitated this book was there was a move. And I was moving from a large house to a smaller house, and I was told by many friends that my piano, which is a grand piano and it's 7 feet, would not fit in the smaller house, which I found really ironic because that's how I began, was that the house was too small. And I was now faced with really was for me an existential question of, can I live without the piano? And I actually talked to someone about selling it, and I sat down in the empty space in the bigger house, which was at this point ready to be sold, and I said, I cannot live without this piano. It has been with me for over 35 years. And so I moved it into the smaller house, and it does just fine. So has been for me kind of a lifeblood and an outlet, much like the artwork, much
Terrific.
like making a book.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. That's a great story. Wonderful. Moving to you, Ray. You describe yourself as a millennial librarian, a poet, printer, and book artist, which is really a good thing because all those baby boomers, we need Gen Xers and millennials to come in behind us to keep this organization moving into the next decade. So really glad to have you on board. So I take it you were born, between 1981 and 1996. So you're somewhere between 26 and 42, and you don't have to tell me what that is, but depending on your birth year, Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton was the first president that you knew. And like today, the beginning of your generation began with high inflation. It was 10.35%. And the price of gas rose to $1.25. But my question is, how does being a millennial influence your art and your poetry?
Well, my poetry came first, as I like to say. From a very young age, I was a poet, and I had always been searching for a way to make that tangible, because I'm a digital native and nothing's tangible to me. And I've never really considered myself an artist. I usually consider myself a writer. Until I got into high school, I got into zine making, and I kind of went backwards in time from there. In college, I took my first letterpress class, and that was the ticket. I was like, this is my art form. It was something that I could easily wrap my head around. Like there's a formula for letterpress to set the type, to put it in the chase, to register the paper, but then you can kind of throw that out the window and make something new as well, and kind of inventive. So, and I think what drew me most to letterpress was that tangible aspect of it. I didn't really know how to describe it until I read an article where they quoted Anais Nin, an author of erotica, who published one of her books, Winter of Artifice, via letterpress. And they asked her why letterpress and things like that. And her response was really, really great. It was exactly how I was feeling. Because when you letterpress print, she said something along the lines of, you pit your faculties against concrete problems. It's not abstract anymore. You can see the type that's broken and you pull it out and you replace it with new type. And it's a challenging process too, but you can ultimately succeed, and then you have a physical representation of your success. So I think that's really what drew me to it and why I keep doing it.
Okay, great, thank you.
Cool.
So, Kim, your book is very personal, and I want to be respectful with my questions. I know it reflects your experience as your mother's metastatic brain cancer took her life, so I see it as very layered and honoring both your grandmother and mother. You describe your book as a mazefold in which you incorporated stitched pieces of your grandmother's quilt along with cloth scraps from your mother, and you incorporated them in the book in the order in which they were made. And I would hope that you could share with us the significance of placing the stitching in the book in the order in which they were made.
Oh, interesting question. I did that, I definitely did that on purpose because accidentally, as I was, home, eat dinner, maybe sit in front of the television and, watch something for an hour or a half hour and sit there and stitch, I was stacking them up on a little table that's next to the couch, and they just stacked up in the order in which they were made. And as I was looking at them, and this was before I knew that they were going to go into a book, I was realizing that the stitching, even though it was really rather random and unplanned and mostly just meditative stitching, like knitting or anything else, just a repetitive thing to do to calm down. That the pieces were looking to me like they were reflecting my mood, and they got a lot more random and erratic as my mother's illness progressed. I realized that it was important once I decided to put them into a book that the progression of the stitching go in order. And the actual last two pieces of stitching in the book were done after her death, and I really just couldn't get my brain around finishing the last two pieces, but for some reason in the amount of pages I had in the book, I needed two more, and I did them on 2 different days, and they really were chaotic. And I just felt that that putting them in the order in which they were done showed how my life was going at that point. It was a little cathartic to go back and look at it and go, whoa, when I did the large painting and I stepped back and looked at it, I thought, ooh, this is a very angry piece, and that was interesting to me. It was very angry, more angry than I realized. And then when I looked at the stitching, I realized that I could see how my brain was going, and that was a positive thing. It's not I wasn't wallowing in it at the end. It was a little more clinical when I was looking at it, and just could look back and go, oh, this is how I worked through this, and obviously came out the other side, in one piece.
Great, that's wonderful, thank you very much. Lynn, I'm curious about your book, many things about it, but I'm particularly curious why you chose Victorian ephemera to address 21st century loss of civility, and if the defacing of the images, the cabinet cards that are there, was in any way meant to address the historical inequities that women have faced.
You ask such interesting questions, Peter. I'm sure, yes, it, if not consciously, subconsciously does that. The Victorian era was so corseted, and roles were so clear, and everyone knew what they should and shouldn't be doing, and it didn't last. And what we have now is an era in which none of the rules are clear. Everything is changing, and I'm sure there are people who think it's changing for the better. I am not one of those people. I am more pessimistic about it. And there were, to take the cabinet cards and to essentially deface them. I collaged on some of them. I scratched out faces on others. I sewed embroidery thread over others. It felt like the way to depict the chaotic nature of what we have right now. And the photographs are particularly fascinating for me. I've done a lot of pieces with sometimes cabinet cards. This is probably the third Victorian album I've done, if not the fourth, and I'll do more. And I like taking vintage snapshots and working with those and doing it, but they represent to me what is real about life, and at the same time, it's totally unreal. All photographs are lies, and they are what you make of them. They don't represent the truth. So that seemed appropriate to this mission.
Okay, thank you so much. So, Ray, the title of your book mirrors the suggested theme of the exhibit, and which all of you responded to. Almost all the books did, but wasn't required. It was a suggested theme, but an awful lot of people picked up on it, I think, for some very good reasons. But Ray, the color palette for your book is all black and white, and I'd like to know how you arrived at those decisions.
Yeah, I think it's just to accompany the photographs that I took. That's the first thing that I created as part of this book, was the photographs. Using instant film, I have a camera that has a double exposure option on it, so it will take 2 photos. So all the photos throughout the book, you'll see me talking to myself. Basically, there's 2 images of myself. And it just worked better with black and white film than color film. I had a black background. I wear mostly black and white. It's kind of my aesthetic. So that's just how it came to be. I also, when I was writing the poetry and envisioning these overlapping, intersecting waves, I almost saw them looking like TV static. And that's part of the reason why I used French speckle tone paper, is to kind of mimic that static feeling that I was getting. So that may also be why I chose black and white.
Okay, thank you. Nancy, I had to look this up, but not all of it. Because I think we all know that pianos have a broad potential for expression, much in the same way that artist books do. Pianos have 88 keys, I bet you know that.
Yes, I do.
I don't know how many an accordion has, but
Not enough.
a lot, but not enough. Anyway, the 36 black ones, I'm told, are for sharps and flats, and 52 white keys are
Right.
natural music notes.
Yes.
So in addition to its origami-like structure, what do you consider the keys to your book?
Oh, my goodness. You do ask interesting questions.
That's my job.
When I was actually putting this book, when I was doing the dummy, and I actually made a spreadsheet of what I'd consider to be the musical periods in my life where I was really active. And I tried to pull out of those things some key points. And I found that I had too many of them, and some of them were kind of low points when I wasn't really active, but kind of frustrated because I didn't have a piano. And so what I tried as key points actually in this book, I first thought when I was making this particular structure, because it's very pointed, that I would be able to put the peaks that matched the text. But in fact, that was virtually impossible because at one point you can't write across the peak of it. And then the valleys didn't fit. So I just decided to take the keys to this book were really the key points in my life where something about the incident, for example, I came to Washington, I grew up in Southern California, and my father grew up here. So one summer when I was 12, my brother and I came and spent the summer with my grandparents out in Vaughan. And the highlight of that summer was for me walking through the woods down to the church. It's a little tiny community church, isn't there anymore. And they had a piano and an organ. And in those days, the doors were open. And so you could just go in. And so I would go down on a regular basis and just find the piece that I needed. It was quiet, and I could play whatever I wanted to play. And that for me was, when I look back on that memory, was a real key point. In contrast to that, I lived and worked outside the United States. And when I did, I had to put the piano into storage. And I did not have a piano. I lived and worked in Spain. And I was surrounded by flamenco music night and day, because in my apartment complex was a gentleman who was a very accomplished guitarist, but he played only flamenco guitar all the time. And that was, for me, it was a really eye-opening experience, because I had to listen to the music, and the rhythm to flamenco music is very different than the rhythm, for example, in Bach. Now there are some things that happen, but it was almost a low point because I had no piano, but by the same token, it was a really eye-opening experience where it was so much infused in the culture and in the apartment building where I was, that I actually learned to appreciate the music for what it was, even though I didn't exactly understand because flamenco can be many things, and it's very, very emotional. And that was an interesting experience. So the keys in this book were really, there were parts of it that were highs, and there were actually parts of it that were lows. And I tried to balance some of the highs and the lows in the book so that I had some of the things, we'll call them sharps, but actually sharps can be more brilliant. They can actually, in musical terms, the sharp keys can actually add a lot of spark because they go up. Sharps always go up, and the black keys that are flats, of course, they're the same thing, go down. So it depends on the key that you're playing.
Sure.
And so as a consequence, you can learn a Bach prelude in C sharp major, which is actually D flat major, okay?
Okay, you've got me
But they
thoroughly
sound
confused.
entirely different. And so in that sense, I was trying to get some of those peaks and valleys to be like sharps and flats and then as a trail through all of that, like the music itself, the text is written on a manuscript stave. So it's got two lines, and they are the treble and the bass clef. So you get both those contrasting things as part of the book, but they're very subtle.
Thank you. Yeah, that's more than I understood. But I'm a musical novice. But so I knew there were some particular things that were going on there. I could tell by looking at the book.
Yeah.
So it's nice to have the explanation of that. So, Lynn,
Sir. Sounds like a challenge or a
you
gauntlet.
note that you took up making artist books after retiring from the practice of law.
That's correct.
The only other book artist I know that was an attorney was Charles Hobson, who you may be familiar with. He's from California. But has your former career influenced the topics you choose to tackle? If so, can you share some particulars, including why collage is a favorite medium?
You know, I was a lawyer for 25 years maybe. And when I retired, I always thought, and I read a lot the whole time, raised two daughters and was way too busy. I thought I would write. I thought I would write the great American trash novel. And then when I actually had time, what I wanted to do was make images. And so I have no art training, so I sort of did my own version of training. I for 6, 7, 8 years, I made collages, lots and lots of collages. And they all live at home in a series of notebooks that I have. And it's a little bit like Kim's sewing. As it progresses, you see how your mind changes and where it's going. And after I did collage for a couple years, I decided I wanted to tell a little bit more of a story. And so I've essentially often just integrate collage techniques into altered books or artist books and end up with the same kind of a thing but more involved. Probably the only thing that I carry over from my law career is not a choice of topics but maybe an approach. I research things to death and enjoy doing it. One of my books was about the color blue, and I know more about the color blue than any human being needs to know. But I enjoy it, and out of that, I think the important thing about an artist book is what Laura Russell, whom you mentioned, she's a wonderful person, she said it was important to have a context for your book. It can't just be pictures and whatever, but each book, whatever the context might be, that sort of frames the book and is your message to the world. And I think that comes out of my law career too. I really feel like there's a process I go through, and some books are quick, some books take a long time, but I'll probably have a lot of research in them, so that's probably what's left over from my legal career.
Okay, thank you. That's.
And I'm really sensitive to copyright issues too.
You are?
Yeah.
Yes, that's probably a good idea for all of us to remember, yes. Kim, the title of your book is Grief, which is the normal process of reacting to a loss, particularly a very severe loss. Loss is always painful, and it can include anger, guilt, anxiety, sadness, despair. You mentioned that there was some anger in your book. I'm wondering if there are other pieces that relate to the normal response to profound grief.
In the other things that in the book, probably, well, anger at a death is always kind of a surprise, I think, a surprise emotion. A lot of it had to do with the fact that I'm also the executor, and I've had to go through all of that. So while my siblings were processing the sadness, I was dealing with probate lawyers and looking at the huge amount of bins of things that my mother collected that I was going to have to go through. I think some of the other emotions probably that relate to the book were just the method of putting some things back together in a certain order. And I think that's what a lot of people end up having to do after a loss, is to reassemble. So it was an interesting process for me, because I can title the book Grief, and that sounds real profound and stark, and yet it's also, for me, more standing back and clinically looking at something and trying to put the things back in order that were fragmented or found in pieces. And that is what, part of what I did in the book with the stitching. And I don't think that I necessarily, that wasn't planned, but as I looked at it later, I saw it as maybe subconsciously, adding the things from the quilt from my grandmother that were falling apart, putting those back in and stitching them carefully down, and taking little pieces of scraps from quilts that my mom had done, and taking those little tiny pieces and stitching them in place, is just kind of more of a trying to reassemble things and maybe sewing them down so they don't move around or something. I don't know. That's getting a little out there, but trying to get some control back. And I think that that might have been part of that process that I can see that I put into it.
Great, thank you for sharing that. This has been great. We have a few minutes left. If there's anything that each of you would like to say about your book, so people might not pick it up on the first pass, we have time for 1 or 2 sentences about what people should look for when they're looking at your book in the case, because that'll be going on for another month. And so it'll be interesting if you have something. If not, we can wrap it here. But so it's kind of whoever would like the floor. If you have something to share, Lynn?
No,
You would not like the floor. Okay. All right.
I will only say, I feel about the exhibition like I feel about all books exhibition. I wish everybody who comes could take the book
Yeah.
and open it up and look through it page by page, and each one of these books would benefit by being able to hold it, and watching you unfold your book was wonderful. So handle it if you can. I don't know how you will, but
Right. Well, we do have an open cases event, but they will occur before this broadcast occurs. But so that's one way we're trying to do it. But I couldn't agree more that when you cage the books, you really eliminate a lot of the meaning because there's so much about texture and turning the pages, the noise, all of the stimuli that we can take on, whether it's hearing or looking or even olfactory, makes a difference. So that's something we struggle with, but we're trying to do the best that we can. But it's nice of you to point that out. And so, without further comment, I want to thank each of you
thank you,
for
Peter.
taking the time today to be with us. It's very important. We should do it for 56 other books,
Yeah.
because I know a lot more now, and I've handled the book along with Rachel and Mark and Tracy way more than anybody else will even get the chance to. And still we miss so much because you just need it. You need time with it. And so this is our attempt to at least give the membership time with your 4 books. And so to all our PSBA members, I want to express on their behalf their gratitude for your taking the time to do this, and the inspiration I think it gives us all to get back in our studios. So safe travels. Thank you.